Welcome, everyone, to session 8 of this wonderful conference. This has really been a terrific set of sessions, and I hope this one will be as equally successful. Welcome to our panelists and welcome to our participants. We have had 200 people registered for this conference from 25 countries, so truly a global discussion. We're here to discuss the restart agenda as national and global economies emerge from the worst of the pandemic. This will be a period of continuing to meet challenges, of drawing on policy experiences during 2020, and of focusing even more intensely on the dynamics associated with the telecom, media, and technology sector, namely investment, innovation, and trade. International cooperation will be essential because communications and media by definition are global these days, as is public policy development, as we've seen in this conference. Our panelists are very well equipped to discuss these issues, from the US Department of State to global businesses, Amazon and British Telecom, and a prominent policy organization, the European Council on Foreign Relations. So we will begin with opening remarks from each panelist to address priorities and expectations from each of your perspectives, and then we'll have rounds on other more specific questions. We'll begin with Ruth Berry, who at the Department of State is at the Office of International Communications and Information Policy. She's acting director for bilateral and regional affairs. She has been at the State Department for 10 years, has deep expertise around Middle East and foreign assistance, infrastructure, and foreign policy, built originally academically, but also in her work as a congressional staff and at another government agency. I give her bio in more detail than I will for others because we got word on her availability for this panel just yesterday. So welcome, Ruth, and why don't you kick off your priorities? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here today, and thank you for the introduction, Jackie, and thank you to Amanda and IIC for having me here today. I know we have all been in many discussions this past year to highlight the importance of connectivity and digital transformation during this pandemic and to capture and take advantage of lessons learned. So now is a good time to reflect on where we go from here. How do we collaborate with our partners around the globe to implement the best practices we are identifying? How do we take advantage of the increased political focus on digital issues to move us forward in a way that tackles new challenges while still adhering to and promoting our long-standing principles? Right now, we see a lot of discussion on the importance of connectivity and digital inclusion, as well as regulatory and policy activity on topics such as security, privacy, data governance, digital taxation, and trade. And these actions have far-reaching consequences, not just on how we use technology, but on global trade, investment, innovation, and economic growth. New approaches designed to address perceived harms must be carefully designed and calibrated to avoid damaging the positive role played by innovative technologies and companies in modern society, particularly in the wake of COVID-19. And this brings us to the restart agenda and thinking about where we go from here. First, creating and maintaining an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet remains a policy priority for the United States, and international and multilateral cooperation is a key part of this approach. The United States is also firmly committed to expanding the benefits of the internet and the digital economy to every corner of the globe, to help every country take advantage of the tremendous economic and social opportunities these technologies enable. Programs like the State Department and USAID's Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership support the development of open, interoperable, reliable, and secure communications infrastructure through private sector engagement, promotes transparent regulatory policies for free and competitive markets, and builds partner cybersecurity capacities to address shared threats. And we also have opportunities through multilateral organizations to work with the global community to advance the ICT development agenda. Forums in 2021, such as the ITU World Telecommunications Development Conference, or WTDC, will allow us to focus needed attention on the reality that nearly half the world's population remains unconnected, and to deliver results in real action. International cooperation is also critical for stimulating the development of new and emerging technologies, such as AI and 5G. But the development of these technologies must be built on security, trust, and principles of openness and respect for the rule of law and human rights. So we also think the Restart agenda should include a reaffirmation of shared values for the continued evolution of digital technology in society. We want our citizens to live in a world where the rule of law and fundamental human rights are respected, where innovation leads to better lives and not just increased government control, where economic freedom is the foundation of free societies. The pandemic has further elevated attention and importance of the security of our communications networks. While ICT development has created tremendous economic growth opportunities, it has also increased risks associated with untrusted vendors who engage in market distorting practices, and especially when these providers are subject to the laws of countries with authoritarian regimes. The US government first applied a principle of trust to the development and deployment of next generation 5G networks. In 5G deployments, allowing untrusted high-risk vendors into any part of the network, including the radio access network, makes critical systems vulnerable to disruption, manipulation, and espionage. It puts sensitive government, commercial, and personal information at risk. Recognizing the risks of untrusted suppliers across the ICT ecosystem beyond just 5G infrastructure, the State Department also announced the Clean Network Initiative. This effort is rooted in internationally accepted digital trust standards, such as the Prague Proposals, and represents an effort to address the long-term and comprehensive threats to data privacy, intellectual property, security, and human rights posed by authoritarian actors such as the Chinese Communist Party and enabled through digital technologies. The United States seeks to build an international coalition committed to safeguarding ICT infrastructure from malign state-sponsored efforts. And the last point I will raise is that we believe that similar efforts of coordination among allies are the most effective way to advance shared digital economy principles while counterbalancing the PRC. The US and the European Union particularly share deep and interconnected transatlantic economic relationships that are integral to remaining globally competitive. We are bound together by our shared commitment to the political principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, as well as to the economic principles of market-based capitalism and free trade. In practice, however, some of the measures we've seen proposed in Europe look more like new regulations and industrial policies that stifle innovation or introduce obstacles for US digital companies, creating new barriers to transatlantic trade. Digital sovereignty shouldn't mean digital protectionism. Through cooperation, we have demonstrated the strength of our shared values, despite our differing regulatory approaches. For instance, in the digital economy, better enabling us to stand against those who would use technology to promote authoritarianism. We must work together to fight back against this new model of techno-authoritarianism. Working with the international community and based on our shared common values, we can chart an optimistic path where technology serves to empower individuals and allows our citizens and economies to reach their full potential. The United States will continue to engage multilaterally to promote international norms and best practices based on our shared values and democratic principles. We will continue to work with the private sector, civil society, and other stakeholders to promote internet freedom, build trust, and enhance transparency. Thank you.
So thank you, Ruth. That was a really great kind of stage setting on a number of issues. Chris, that takes us to you. Chris Wilson from Amazon.
Sure. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks to you and the IIC for putting together this conference again. It's always an annual event I look forward to. I had the pleasure of participating in a panel discussion 2 years ago, in person, of course, in Washington. I look forward to the days where we can be in person again, hopefully a year from now, God willing. but thanks very much again for having me. As Jackie said, I'm Chris Wilson from Amazon. I coordinate our internet governance policy work. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office, and I've been with the company now for about 3.5 years. Obviously, Amazon cares deeply about these issues, and myself have been, sort of at the forefront of a lot of these discussions, both before the pandemic and of course during the course of the pandemic. And Amazon itself has been in the middle of many important work during the pandemic, of course, from a retail side, but also from our cloud computing side with AWS, et cetera. I find the topic and the name of the topic interesting when we talk about restart. And I think indeed there are certainly right to focus on restarting, if you will, the digital economy and that digital policy work that we are doing. I will say, though, there are certain parts of the world and certain areas where it didn't even start to begin with. And perhaps this is an opportunity where we can say it's time to start those discussions because I think the pandemic has taught us a few things, and I know from three key learnings from Amazon's perspective is one, obviously, and it's been mentioned by Ruth and others, I'm sure, in the course of the conference, the stark difference between connecting and unconnecting those that are around the world, and the need for every individual in the world to be able to have access to an internet connection, but also have the ability to actually fully utilize that internet connection. And of course, that means capacity building and building up digital skills. Much work to be done there. We knew that before the pandemic, and it's certainly true now. A second key learning, and I think that will hopefully inform mutual cooperation, multilateral cooperation going forward, is the need for economic inclusiveness. In particular, the need to get small and mid-sized businesses around the world online and be able to reach customers globally from wherever they may be. Certainly here in the United States, we saw that there were small, mid-sized businesses that had no online presence, that were sort of caught flat-footed, quite frankly, by shutdowns and store closures, and that saw immediately the need to have an online presence to be able to reach their customers. And then third is something that I haven't seen talked about as enough, frankly, but I think is important, is the need for each individual country and its public sector to be able to more fully embrace digital technology to service their constituents, which are in essence their customers. Unfortunately, the pandemic also brought into stark relief some of the antiquated technology that many state and local governments and federal governments are using right now, and it's hindered their ability to fully service their constituents. One quick anecdote: I know in the state of Ohio here in the United States, it was determined that the employment agency in Ohio was relying on technology built in 1975. And that's certainly just not feasible in today's world. And their constituents suffered a little bit because of that. So I think renewed focus on public sector adoption of digital technologies is hugely important. So setting sort of the pandemic aside and the challenges that we see there, I think it's important to also recognize that there is sort of certainly a movement, if you will, over the last few years between sort of this notion of techno-democracies and techno-autocracies, and what does digital sovereignty mean? I recall being standing in the room in the IGF in 2018 in Paris, and listening to Emmanuel Macron deliver his keynote speech at the IGF, where he sort of provided an overview and sort of a roadmap of where he sees sort of the evolution of digital governance, shall we say, between on one hand, sort of perhaps a more US-based approach, on the other hand, perhaps a more China-based approach, and then, of course, perhaps approach-based maybe somehow in the middle. And so that conversation has began even before then, but certainly was brought to most attention in 2018 and has evolved in 2019, and of course, certainly in 2020. And so I think the question now with the new administration in the US government and sort of the pandemic bringing some of these issues to light is, how can we certainly enhance that multilateral and multi-stakeholder cooperation going forward? And I think there's a ripe opportunity to do that within a variety of multilateral organizations, of course, not the least of which being the United Nations and the ITU, but also I think the OECD and others as well. So from my perspective and Amazon's perspective, are hopeful that can be accomplished in the coming years. And I think Ruth laid out some really important points that I think are worth continued sort of discussion about. Where can we most spend our best time and focus? Where do we have mutual understanding and agreement? And I think certainly keeping the internet open, secure, stable for all to use and for communication purposes, for e-commerce purposes, et cetera, are hugely important. And Amazon is committed to sort of participating in all of those discussions going forward. So we leave it there. I will say that I think we have the next 2 years especially are going to be quite important with some major policy conferences coming up, which I think serve as forcing mechanisms, if you will, to have these policy discussions, certainly within the ITU construct with the WTDC and the WTPF in 2021. Looking at 2022, we have the WTSA. And of course, the Plenipotentiary Conference at the end of 2022, just some examples of these major sort of conferences that are occurring and that are going to force us, I think, to have these collaborative conversations on what we think is important work. And we'd be remiss if I didn't mention, of course, and I think Ruth sort of touched on it indirectly a little bit, but the notion of network security and where we go forward on that. I think I think most of us are aware. There are proposals certainly within the ITU tied to this notion of network security, and of course, new IP being one of them for future vertical network. I think is an interesting case study in how we should be looking at the network, whether the network needs to be improved, how can it be improved, and to what extent what values are going to be implemented and sort of overlaid, if you will, in those discussions. And I know Amazon and others are engaged in those discussions, and we look forward to further doing so in the coming years. So thanks again, Jackie, for having me, and IIC. I really look forward to your questions and looking forward to hearing from the fellow panelists. Thanks so much.
I'm off mute. Thank you, Chris. That was great. You're really sketching the breadth of all the international organizations. So in our next round of conversation, I want to do a little bit kind of deeper dive on some of what those opportunities and challenges look like. But thanks for this, and that takes us over to Daniel Wilson from British Telecom.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and also to the IIC for inviting me today. Really delighted to take part. And as we look, I suppose, at the theme, investment, innovation, trade, I think those are absolutely the right priorities for the restart, not just because they match my job title as Director of Trade and Innovation at BT, but also I think because they really are what government are focused on across the world, both in the TMT sector, but actually much more broadly, whether you're talking about building back a host of different types of infrastructure, building back better in the UK and US parlance, green deals or new green deals, depending on whether you're in the EU or the US, and also particularly on trade policy and maintaining global supply chains. So really good framing of the debate for us. I think just before getting into each of those themes, I wanted to just touch on, I suppose, the restart itself, because I think it is right that clearly many global economies do need a restart, but perhaps we should see it as not just the sort of, that we're not starting from a standing start, if you like, that, in many ways, digital services kept large parts of the economy in many countries and many aspects of daily life going. So just to give a few perhaps slightly parochial examples to begin with, as a telecoms provider, we were focused particularly at the outset, making sure that health services continued, that we were giving free data to health workers, making sure that there was resilient connectivity for health facilities, and also thinking about our customers and how we maintained reliable connectivity for them as they relied more and more on their internet connections for home working, home healthcare, and homeschooling. So, very interesting, I suppose, what did work and what didn't, and what lessons that can teach us for the recovery. So, we focus particularly in the UK on the residential customers, but also small businesses, where we think their reliance, heard a little from Chris, but their reliance on connectivity and the impact of coronavirus was particularly severe in the UK, and produced a scheme, a small business support scheme, which focused on offering them support with their connectivity, with cash flow issues, and with their confidence, for instance, in digital skills. And then for our international customers, which BT serves as one of the biggest global movers of data cross-border, we focused on, I guess, scaling up their ability to work cross-border exceptionally fast. So that ranged from anything to adding 20 to 30,000 or so connections for remote working for PepsiCo in 3 days, through to a large multinational insurance company setting up a Zoom call for 3,000 of their staff at 3 hours notice. So we've had to move much quicker, I think, than we did before the pandemic. And for those who've been stuck on too many Zoom calls recently, apologies that we're perhaps part of the problem there. But, you know, I think turning to each of those themes now, starting with investment, in each of those areas, we did see you know, challenges as well arising from the pandemic. So looking at investment in networks, our networks were very resilient, but as has already been mentioned, you know, there were clearly issues to do with networks not serving all people equally and people who weren't connected. So that for us is a really important focus going forward, and a focus investing not just in networks, but also investing in skills and digital skills for people to get the most out of them. So that is certainly one of our learnings about the investment priorities going ahead. Secondly, I suppose in terms of network investments, although the networks did hold up remarkably well, you know, a number of the innovative use cases for networks that we see in the future ultimately depend on 5G and fibre investment. So for the UK, which is in the foothills, I think it's fair to say, of investment in those, but with very bold ambitions, we think that's going to be a critical enabler of I suppose, the innovation recovery from COVID. So just briefly on innovation, I mean, I think, you know, we saw certainly tech adoption in the UK market, you know, take some extraordinary strides. So from 10% of local doctors' centres being able to offer home appointments at the start of the pandemic to now 99%. There's been radical tech adoption, but, you know, there's so much more to do. So, you know, we see 5G networks as absolutely critical to anything from smart cities to smart ports, you know, drones to autonomous vehicles. So there's a huge amount that our networks will unlock, we think, for the recovery. But clearly there are challenges around how you support that, the kind of infrastructure around it. And perhaps just to touch on one of those, data and AI growth, I was really pleased to hear what Ruth said about trust in AI and other advanced technologies, because for us, those use cases are a critical driving demand for our products for connectivity. And if there isn't trust in the security around those and you know, the privacy around them for personal data too, then they'll be significantly set back. And just to close finally on trade considerations, I think, you know, we certainly see trade deals and action at a multilateral level too as a huge potential enabler for advanced technologies, for innovation, and actually for investment in networks too. You know, there are some challenges, perhaps not so directly tied to the COVID experience, but issues to do with competitiveness of telecoms markets, and issues to do with risks that data flows cross-border are challenged through data localization, for instance. So, you know, some of that can be resolved bilaterally, and obviously the UK currently is pursuing its sort of first forays at the WTO independently, but also in securing bilateral trade deals. But we do think the WTO and multilateral engagement is going to be absolutely fundamental to that. We're strong supporters of multilateral action, and we'd like to see, for instance, a review of the telecoms reference paper at the WTO, but also a lot more work to encourage data flows cross-border and tackle some of the concerns around trust in data. So we're looking forward to debate, and we hope very much that a lot of it takes part at multilateral level. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, for expressly adding the trade component, WTO and bilateral. So we will now turn to Janka Ertl from the European Council on Foreign Relations and see what she will add to this very complex combination of opportunities for collaboration.
Thank you very much, Jackie and IC for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I definitely have a bit of a different angle on the topic. I come from a geopolitics background. And if you talk to me about the restart agenda, I think about the transatlantic relationship initially. That's my very first thought where it goes to. So I think that the two are very much interlinked. And as all previous speakers have alluded to, kind of the pandemic has hit at a very, very difficult time. It has hit at a time of enormous transatlantic dissonance, at a time of enormous transatlantic friction, and it has thus become a time where the need for digital and communication and digital connectivity has proven to be extremely important, but where it was also kind of overshadowed by broader frictions in the relationship that were then kind of playing out on the same field. A lot of these debates have been overshadowed by the 5G question. And I think Ruth has made a really great point in kind of laying out also the US policy and the US ambition in this regard. But it is in many ways more a symptom than actually a cause. It is more the debate that we have seen unfolding over 5G has been kind of at the heart as a prism through which we could see all of the geopolitical dimensions moving at this very critical juncture. The relationship between Europe and the US, but also the relationship between the US and China, and particularly the relationship between Europe and China being at a moment of kind of redefinition. The debate has served in Europe as an enormously good wake-up call for policymakers in the EU to understand the critical and geopolitical dimension of communications infrastructure. I think that's been one of the key aspects of this, that this is not just, in Europe, it was always about business. It wasn't about the geopolitics of it, and the geopolitics of it have hit really hard very quickly. It has also laid bare a lot of the deficiencies in our European approach that are currently kind of being addressed, where we have understood that some of the kind of harmonization that should have taken place within the EU just hadn't taken place over this time, where a lot of the questions on cybersecurity questions, etc., just hadn't been addressed appropriately over the years to come, but also where our relationship to kind of what vendors can be, what role vendors play in our networks just hadn't been fully gamed through. So I think it's right that Ruth said, there are a number of principles that we're now debating, but like the Prague principles, this is not something that is not contested within Europe still as an issue or as a kind of baseline agreement. And I'm sitting here in Berlin, so I'm kind of at the heart of a lot of these debates at the moment. That being said, I think we're at this very moment that we are right now, and in the beginning of the next year, the opportunity for transatlantic cooperation around these issues to restart the digital conversation and the agenda transatlantically could not be better. I think this is a perfect moment to talk about kind of the 5G rollout, but also 6G development. This will be at the heart of where we will move in the future. It is key to arrive, and it's interesting that Daniel, you were referring to this from a kind of different angle, but I think it's key to arrive at a level of trust again, also between the countries, the regions, to arrive at this, because only through this form of geopolitical trust will you arrive at the level of then kind of having the trust in building the networks and relationships commercially as well. I think it is also absolutely crucial to instill the market with a greater degree of competitive spirit to drive innovation forward. We cannot, in the face of the geopolitical challenges that we have, and in face of the geopolitical competitors that are out there, we cannot kind of fall into a nice little transatlantic slumber now and say things are great again and we can all go about a jolly good business again. But I think also the question of digital sovereignty in this case should be regarded as a huge opportunity. It is not about digital protectionism when Europe speaks about digital sovereignty. It sometimes doesn't know what it says when it speaks about digital sovereignty because we have failed to fully define what we mean. But I do think that the spirit of this is to become a stronger partner also for the United States, to provide better alternatives, and as a stronger partner, to be a more balanced relationship transatlantically in all of the questions. And I think Europeans need greater confidence in their potential in this area. I think we have often undersold European capacity in this regard, and have thus made a 5G debate that was actually about vendors from Europe versus vendors from China, all about a US-China confrontation. And that's all still mind-boggling to many of the European observers how that could have happened. The 5G debate was a watershed moment here in Europe. And I think if we draw the right lessons from it at this juncture at the moment, we can come out ahead, and this can actually be a boost to not only competitiveness, but also to innovation, to the spirit, and to kind of actually facilitate transatlantic trust and transatlantic digital trade to allow for a better understanding of cross-border data transfer and how this will look like in the future. But if we don't draw the right conclusions, the combination, this will kind of lead to us losing the competitive edge over time. And to be very clear here, I'm not sure we're there yet. We haven't fully figured out these questions so far, especially sitting here in Berlin. I can only say that it still will need a little bit of time and nudging and conversations to arrive and to draw the right conclusions from the debate. We're still in the midst of it. This isn't behind us. So technology cooperation, I think Chris has referred to it as well, will definitely be about values. And I think that's where we should instill this debate again with the kind of a joint framework that we can find, and to make sure that this will not be about business in the future and business interests, but about what we actually can share and can build together. Maybe I'll leave it here for kind of the geopolitical ending, and then we can have a discussion about this as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. There's a lot in there to think about and to discuss. And it reminds me of the fact that the IIC really sees itself as a convener of a full range of views. So this is a good place to look at nuances and differences. I would say I might just pose one small follow-up question for you, Janka, about the new legislation, the DSA and DMA proposals and actions next week, asking you how you think that might be relevant, because I'm thinking that the messaging around that could convey viewpoints and values and so on key issues at a key time. Could you give us just a little bit of thought?
So I think what we need to be very mindful of at the moment here in Europe is that we don't set ourselves up at the moment for failure. And I'm not sure that the timing that we are at the moment looking at is always the best. The European actions that are being taken are kind of, because it's such a slow machinery that when it starts moving, and then it's really hard to adapt it to geopolitical processes that are ongoing at the same time. So I think that's where we are at the moment in these debates. I do think that in general, the thinking around questions of privacy and of regulating data markets is something that is so important to the constituencies in Europe. It's so important to the voters in Europe that this is a key issue that will have to be dealt with here. But I do think that we need to start entering in a better dialogue again about these questions transatlantically very, very quickly, because otherwise we can maybe make our cooperation more difficult than it should be at a critical juncture where we are at the moment.
Great, thank you. So first, let me ask the other panelists whether you have any questions or comments you might want to share with each other. And if there are none of those, we'll just go into a deeper discussion on some of the different venues, some of the views on how this greater cooperation, what did we call it here? We called it international cooperation. I think we've talked quite a bit on priorities, but not so much on exactly how they would be moved in different channels for cooperation. But do you have any comments? If anybody wants to talk to each other, yeah. I was going to say, just raise your hand. So.
Sure, I can follow up a little bit on particularly what Janka said. I agree that the opportunity is there for increased transatlantic cooperation and even potentially a restart looking ahead towards a change in administration on the U.S. side, as well as conversations domestically about privacy or other sort of tech regulation. And as the United States thinks through its approach, that could create more opportunity for conversations with Europe. But I think, one area where we tend to be concerned is that it seems like Europe, if you look at GDPR as an example, tends to be very proscriptive, not just what are our shared values and how do we protect them, but very proscriptive on how you get there. And so with those sort of rigid frameworks that do not enable interoperability, it's very difficult for us to come up with, shared approaches that enable transatlantic trade between the US and Europe, let alone for us to go to third countries and say, whether it's developing countries in Latin America or Africa or, Central Asia or, the other part of the Asian regions, to say, we are offering an alternative approach to other authoritarian models of digital governance that, China and others are seeking to export through their programs, through their assistance, through deal financing. And so I agree that the first thing upon us is for the US and Europe to get on the same page with sort of an interoperable, policies that promote shared values. But it's going to be a tough road. And I think, the most recent, I think GDPR is a very good example of that. And so I would hope that these other sort of digital pieces of legislation are not as rigid as that is, to sort of enable, continued conversations. And I also just want to say that I agree with you that 5G was a good test case because it was something very specific that we could really highlight the risks and the importance of taking these serious, but also the sort of economic failings of the market that have really consolidated vendors, and how do we restart competitiveness in that space, but that 5G is not the be-all end-all, and we need to be able to sort of expand that clarity of sort of purpose and understanding of risks and opportunities to a broader set of digital issues.
So, Daniel, I actually have a trade follow-up question. I think that's related to what you were saying. You were talking about digital trade, a lot of different opportunities, bilateral, WTO, etc. Recently, there have been a couple articles about trying to create almost like a new trade bloc of like-minded countries and doing a new digital trade model on that. I've read a couple of those in the last week or so. It's somewhat related to what both Ruff and Janka are talking about in terms of like-mindedness transatlantically, or even more broadly in Ruth's case. Have you been following that at all? And do you see, well, whether you've been following or not, do you see that there might be opportunities to try to build off of like-minded coalitions? That's too formal a word, but it's a little bit like what the TPP tried to do in Asia, right? Create a like-minded group. Can you give any feedback on that sort of an idea?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think our starting point really is that there is a hierarchy in trade deals between how sort of profound and progressive you can be and the number of countries involved. Negotiations with on a multilateral level take a lot of time, and there is an element of moving as fast as the slowest member on whatever issue it happens to be, and that will vary on whatever it is. So we definitely see a scope for plurilateral deals and bilateral deals which raise the bar on digital. I mean, we've been following quite closely the deeper deal between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand, which has seen quite big commitments to, for instance, use of digital identities, online verification, and also sort of around digital ethics, if you like, which is definitely set, I think, was certainly moved things forward in terms of what you can do with a small number of countries on digital trade. And we certainly hope that that's something which a number of other countries can look at and learn from. So we know that the UK actually just agreed a trade deal with Singapore last night, I think, a rollover deal from the EU. But certainly, I think that those two countries would see themselves as leaders in digital trade. I mean, I think it's worth saying also, I don't think the WTO is the only vehicle for those kind of areas of progress on digital issues or digital ethics. So, for instance, we really welcome the GPay initiative, the global partnership on AI, which a number of countries have supported across the Atlantic and elsewhere. Again, which is really focused on responsible tech and using AI and signing up to a shared set of values. So we think there are a number of vehicles for that. We'd hope that the UK, with its chairmanship of the G7, can get some put some muscle behind some of those efforts on digital as well as a number of other areas.
Okay, so let's go to the kind of a next level, sort of the second round after these more specific feedback. And Chris, perhaps you could lead us off. You outlined the many venues in which international cooperation is possible and desirable. So do you have further thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't mention it in sort of my opening remarks, but I think it's also worth mentioning, that back in July, the Secretary General of the United Nations, launched his roadmap for digital cooperation, which I think also is another opportunity where all stakeholders, so not just governments, but also industry and others, have an opportunity to provide input on a variety of core digital policy issues. Connectivity, I think, sort of being the top of the list, quite frankly. Again, trying to connect all by 2030 remains a top priority. And so I think, I actually think that is probably, if not one of the most important ones that I think all countries can get behind, right? I think there's definitely a need to work collaboratively in that regard. In some cases, it's getting rid of regulatory underbrush. In some cases, it's providing greater incentives for investment, whatever the case may be. I can tell you, from Amazon, we have a project called Project Kuiper, a satellite-based internet delivery service that we intend to launch in the coming years as another avenue to provide service to the unconnected around the world. But that's just one example. Obviously, there's many others from a private sector standpoint, but also I think ways in which civil society and others can help provide those connections too. So I think as I mentioned, obviously some very important conferences are taking place within the ITU construct in the coming years, next 2 years, that I think will shed further opportunity and light on how we can drive forward these discussions. I think certainly WTDC is a great opportunity for that. I know Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who runs the ITUD, has connectivity front and center for her, and capacity building is obviously front and center there. I think to the extent that we weren't engaged or others weren't engaged in those conversations before, that now we are, and that's a good opportunity there. I'd also I think, Jack, it's also important to suggest that I think there needs to be better and enhanced sort of coordination among multilateral organizations. And Daniel mentioned GPI. I actually think it's an interesting example where GPI has a secretariat now hosted within the OECD. And the purpose of which was to make sure that the ongoing AI policy work that the OECD is doing and the OECD policy guidelines, AI policy guidelines, are complementary to whatever the GPI may be doing. In other words, they aren't duplicating work or veering away from important work that was already done. So I think that's perhaps a shining example where I think more enhanced coordination within multilateral organizations can also enhance the collaboration that is necessary going forward. And I hope that we can see more examples of that in the coming years as well.
Daniel, are you also following the Secretary General's roadmap? The UN roadmap for digital cooperation? If you are, I thought maybe you could add something to what Chris has said. And I would ask of both of you, and Janka looks as if she'd like to speak on this as well. And I try to comment on how business can be involved in that, because that's a question I get a lot. We're all following what it's doing. I'm an attorney, and my clients are usually businesses, so that's the way that it comes across my radar screen. And we provided a lot of input into what the outcomes of the UN group, the high-level expert panel said. Certain businesses were in the roundtables and so on and so forth. But as we look ahead in the year to come, what would one say to a business who says, these are really important topics, the UN and the Secretary General are obviously key players, and what is the role there for trying to engage and make all of that as productive as possible? And it's a tricky balance, productive but not duplicative, I think, in the way that Chris was saying, can sometimes be a risk. So I'm going to mute myself, and Daniel, if you want to make a comment, and then Janka and Ruth.
Great. Yeah, just very briefly, because we're probably not as close to it as Chris is, but I think where we have focused less is on connectivity for in developing countries, but much more on digital skills. So BT has a Skills for Tomorrow program, as we call it, which is getting 10 million people digital skills by 2025 in the UK, but is also doing a lot in a number of developing countries. So one of the partnerships I've worked on a little bit is a scheme we have in India to get adolescent girls there, to provide them life skills via digital tools. So we're focused a bit more on the digital skills side. And I think just more broadly, because Janka will probably have more to say on all of this than me, but more broadly, I guess we are very conscious of the alignment of our effort with sustainable development goals. So, it's a core feature of our annual reports, and we're very conscious of our responsibilities as a business to work to deliver against those UN goals.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here on two kind of keywords that are very striking for the debates that we have in the kind of foreign policy circles. So it's connectivity and the multilateralism debate. On connectivity, this is one of the key conversations currently going on within the EU, how to expand what we have, the EU-Asia connectivity strategy, to a more global framework, to encompass just kind of a wider territory, but also to just be more comprehensive and to create better interfaces to cooperate with other initiatives that are out there, be it Japan, be it Australia, but be it also Blue Dot initiatives and the US initiatives. So I think if we can create financing, if we can create kind of a standards basis here, that would be very much in the European interest as well, and it would kind of serve multiple purposes, not only from like an industrial strategy perspective and a global standards perspective, but also from a kind of pushback against Belt and Road Initiative perspective. There are a number of elements in there that are being debated at the moment. It is currently stuck a little bit in the interinstitutional fighting at the Brussels level, because it also requires to kind of break silos and think about how to creatively integrate development assistance with industrial strategy. And we're not there yet, but this is on a good path. And this is an interesting initiative that is just kind of, it still needs a little bit of time, but I do think that it will create exactly the interfaces that, Ruth, that you were also talking about, where we kind of need to make all the initiatives that come fit in a way that they also then, do not inhibit cooperation in the future, because that would just be silly at a time where global competition is just so high on the agenda. And that brings me to the multilateralism question. I think one of the key features that we have been overlooking from a European standpoint, where multilateralism is so much in our DNA, where here in Berlin, it's almost a religion, I would say. It's something to cherish to a degree that it can become kind of a self-serving idea. And we have overlooked that by our willingness and our great incentive and idea to cooperate with China in multilateral organizations, how at times, especially Chinese players, have undermined the purposes of multilateral organizations and have been kind of have pursued policies that run counter to the ideas of a specific organization. So I think there is a realization now that it takes better partnerships to also push back against growing Chinese influence in multilateral organizations, because that will definitely serve a European goals. And it's really important to be very specific there on the details, on the tiny kind of wordings, because we have failed to pay enough attention to the incremental creep that has been happening on the multilateral level.
Ruth, do you want to jump in at this point?
Sure. I think hearing of the good work, for example, that BT is doing, I know Amazon has a number of, programs around the globe. The United States, as I mentioned, has the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership, which has a number of lines of efforts. It's been about 70 million in foreign assistance in the past 2 years, with additional budget requests going forward. There's a lot of great work being done out there, and I do think the challenge is really how can governments and donor countries, along with the incredible efforts of the private sector and international private sector, really work together, because I think that's where we're going to get more bang for our buck, and where we will truly help enable emerging markets to realize the full potential. And so I think, with the upcoming ITU Development Conference, I think that's a great opportunity for sector members, but as well as the governments, to really focus on action. What are we doing today? I think there's a lot of good sort of development policies and connectivity policies and roadmaps. And I think what's really the challenge next is just take the work we're doing and harmonize it and coordinate it to make sure we're being as effective as possible. And so, and just multilaterally, I agree that we don't want to see duplicative bodies set up or contradictory work. There's a lot of opportunity to work in the OECD on these issues, but also G7, G20, and the United States is committed to sort of working through these processes. And I think when you work through multilateral organizations, you also get, by definition, greater interoperability, because you have a shared set of sort of desired outcomes and end states and approaches that then each country can implement within their own systems in a way that makes sense.
Great, thank you for that. Chris, do you want to add anything to this conversation? It's iterative, and back to you again. Or?
Sure, no, thanks, Jackie. I mean, I think, I think one of your earlier questions may have been sort of how do businesses, or how business and others engage with, sort of on the roadmap specifically, and I think the sort of work going into the roadmap has been gone over the course of a couple of years now, and obviously there's been inputs provided there. I think going forward, it'll be interesting to see how that roadmap is going to be implemented, and I think it'll be interesting. I know part of that roadmap includes the creation of a tech envoy within the Secretary General's office, and engaging with that person, I think, will be an important part of that. And I know that they've dubbed it the first port of call for engagement with the UN, perhaps on some of these tech policy matters. So we'll see. I think we'll look forward to that appointment sometime next year, and then how we can move forward with that. But I think I think there are there's certainly a lot of interesting touch points within that document. In most cases, leveraging, I think, work that's being done elsewhere, including, but certainly within the UN, but elsewhere. And I think behooves everyone to sort of double down, shall we say, on that work and be engaged there. There's no shortage of opportunities. Let's put it that way in the coming years to provide input. And I should say, I think I applaud Secretary General and others for seeking outside input beyond just member states and seeking that input from others as well. And I think the roundtables that occurred over the course of the last couple of years were helpful in that regard. Hopefully, will continue to be helpful going forward.
It's such an interesting period that we're in, right? And the pandemic, it seems like it's exaggerated trends in very significant ways. It's amplified them. But what I was thinking about as we were going through this conversation is two really kind of parallel trends. One is that connectivity is front of mind for every organization, right? Because that has really been heightened, digital divide and connectivity. If you just look back over this year, immediately every organization, including private sector organizations, the International Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, but the Broadband Commission, the OECD, the ITU, everybody came out with, rightfully, an analysis of what was needed, a conclusion that connectivity had to be the top priority, recognition of ways that we didn't really realize the nature and depth of problems that could arise in an unforeseen situation like this. There was a panel earlier today where Susan Ness, former commissioner, FCC commissioner, and very active around transatlantic issues, said, we at the FCC some time ago set up great connectivity funding programs for schools, but it never occurred to us that children wouldn't be in the schools, right? And that we had to think of connectivity in that way. So you've got that clear trend and a lot of things that would follow from that. Then we have the wave, the imminent wave of regulation, I think, right? Because again, if you look at this conference, there have been so many discussions about platform regulation. As I look back over the last year, trying to figure out what's going to happen with AI, we got the principles from the OECD that are around ethics and the human factor. That's absolutely key, but we're now in a wave of how do you implement that? And I think that 2021 is going to be the year of more and perhaps enforceable codes of conduct, something along those lines. And if you look at panelists here, because since I'm on the IIC board, I actually have been going to some of the sessions and I've learned a huge amount. There's a unanimity on the prospect of some greater, what do I want to say, structured governance, right? I'm not saying it has to be law, it has to be new law, but that on certain issues more needs to be done. So that then, it's almost as though we've had two huge global regulatory policy waves of consultation occurring de facto, just because of things that have happened at policy making that's being considered. So that then, I think, says something about the work in international organizations for the coming year, right? There will be focus on those two kind of prongs of commitment, say, on the connectivity side, but also policy making around enabling and other types of governance structures. So I wonder if this little soliloquy gives you any thoughts as to, from your vantage point, what will be the key issues and anything else we should be discussing about where those will move. We have touched on a number of venues, from bilateral to regional or plurilateral, multilateral trade. But with those key policy issues happening, and obviously affecting everybody in government, in geopolitical policy expertise and in businesses. So, any food for thought about those kind of macro trends? Ruth, Chris, anything we haven't covered yet?
I would, we've covered a lot of it, I think, but I think, it's interesting. I read the other day that notion of perhaps creating some sort of T12, right? Sort of technology 12 countries, like-minded countries, sort of patterned a bit up to the sort of the G12, if you will, looking at opportunities for collective engagement in all of these different venues, but also sort of more broadly. And I think, there's something to be said for that, and thinking about that, whether it's a formal construct or not. I think Janka has spoken to some of that a little bit earlier, not specifically the T12, but sort of a general notion of that kind of collaboration. These discussions are occurring everywhere, on a macro and a micro level. And I think, you would hope that there's synergies and flows that inform both. It's a two-way street. I would be remiss if I didn't say, though, I think that when in these broader discussions, I wouldn't want to see the, shall we say, competition policy tail wagging this sort of innovation dog. I say that because I think obviously there's a lot of focus on certain companies, mine included, in these spaces. But I think we don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture, and that is ensuring that there is sufficient innovation for others and all. And I mentioned earlier, the enabling small and medium-sized businesses, I think it needs to get more attention, frankly, from these dialogues. I think it will, small and mid-sized businesses drive the economies in almost all of the world, certainly the United States, but elsewhere as well. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't focus on that type of economic inclusiveness when we have these discussions, and ensure that those businesses are able to take advantage of what the internet offers. So I maybe leave it at there, and perhaps Ruth or others may have comments.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, my hesitation in speaking was not because I don't think what you said is right. I actually think it's due. It's just it's a tough issue to think about from where we sit at the State Department of State, which is, a foreign policy organization. But so much of these issues are, how do you sort of promote a U.S. approach to, the digital economy, into regulations and international fora. And that's hard when I think the United States is really just starting to sort of grapple with some of these issues with, conversations around Section 230 or recent FTC actions. And so I think a little bit is going to need to come out in the wash before we are really able to sort of promote, a significantly different approach, if at all, in international organizations or multilaterally. So I think with the U.S. just being one country that's really taking a hard look at these issues, Europe also is taking a number of action, but also countries around the world. What are the things that we can find commonality on to focus on while countries still sort of work out their various approaches? And I also think having international dialogue about how domestic approaches will impact international trade or, interconnected economies is also really important. So I think the conversations are really important to have, that sort of interplay between the domestic and international, but it's a tough thing to sort of manage and orient yourself around, as a government. And, I think, it's probably something too that I would imagine, European member states and interplay with the EU on these sorts of things have similar sort of issues and challenges. And then, of course, making sure that the private sector has a seat at that table and that we hear from them, what is necessary to sort of enable continued economic growth. So I don't know that's so much an answer as just a continued admiration of the problem.
Thank you for that. And let me I'm looking up at the clock, and we have a little over 14 minutes left. This has gone very quickly. So if each of you could think of your sort of wrap-up remarks, about 3 minutes each, and if possible, focusing on takeaways from, as we're coming, hopefully, out of the, we can see kind of, they say, the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the pandemic. The need for connectivity, I talked about that a moment earlier, but there have also been, I think, some interesting policy takeaways that I've heard at, there was a recent IIC session with regulators from Latin America who were talking about how they had used regulatory simplification and some kind of interim spectrum policy as responses to what needed to be done in the pandemic. And then they came to decide to recognize that these were good policies they should have going forward. So any examples along those lines, I think, would be useful. So I'm going to start in kind of reverse order that we began. So Janka, give us some final takeaways from your perspective.
Thank you. I may just kind of do this a bit differently and take it one level above. I think what the pandemic has done is really fundamentally shifted the geopolitical conversation in Europe. We have seen the first instance of active involvement of China in European policy debates, and that has had a very negative implication. What does that mean for the debate that we're having here? It means that all of a sudden, everything that had been considered pure business in Europe is becoming under scrutiny and is kind of undergoing a certain test at the moment of whether that still holds and whether that's still the case. So I do think that we're at a juncture where Europe could become a very different player in the future, just in light of realization that there is a broader and bigger challenge out there, and that all of the questions such as digital connectivity and the future of our technology sectors are very much inherently linked to that debate. And I think we haven't figured it out yet. We're not done with that debate yet. But I think it's a very interesting moment to watch that unfold. And to all of our American friends, I would just say, I think it's important to look into the details of this and look into the speed of how this is evolving. We're talking a development over the past kind of 24 months in total, and particularly the last kind of 12 months in total. And debates on issues such as 5G have shifted in Eastern Europe from one end to the other. They have shifted in various countries, and not just on 5G. On these broader questions, we see fundamental changes in the approach to policy, business, and the relationship between kind of the triangle between the US, China, and Europe. So just kind of keep a close eye on this. This is still moving, and we should be very mindful of the fact that this is very much in flow, and not expect this to be done anytime soon, but to be mindful of that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and that kind of looking at the Europeans from across the Atlantic will require a very nuanced approach in many instances.
Thank you. We'll go to Daniel next.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just to start on a similar, I suppose, multilateral theme, I think that there is enormous potential actually at the moment for greater multilateral cooperation and greater international cooperation. And I'm obviously speaking from London as we're waiting to hear more on Brexit news at the moment, and mindful of a number of barriers that Janka and Ruth have talked about in terms of challenges in the EU, US, China triangle, if you like. But it seems to me there's enormous amount of opportunity there, and we're really keen to work through all of the different levels to support cooperation. I think just to touch on your question, Jackie, about regulatory learnings, and Chris's point about balancing trade and competition. Digital markets are clearly quite different from telecoms markets, and I think some of the thinking is much more nuanced now. For instance, from some of the UK regulatory work around digital markets, but there's certainly a recognition that multinational companies who have delivered enormous amounts of innovation for free to consumers is an important area of innovation. While mindful, I suppose, of how do you support innovation among smaller companies and national companies. So we're really interested in that debate. For the telecom sector, clearly there is a pro-competitive regime already in place. in the UK, and we'd like to see that adopted more widely, and think that the WTO could be an important vehicle for that. But I think, just final point, I think we've seen in the pandemic, in some areas, for instance, the use of data, a lack of clarity. And to Ruth's earlier point about GDPR being too prescriptive, there has certainly been aspects of data sharing for the public good where lack of certainty about GDPR has led to some suboptimal outcomes, if I put it politely. So I think there is a big potential, both at national level but also internationally, to think much harder about pro-competitive, pro-innovation interpretation of regulation, because actually I think there is quite a lot of innovative things you can do under GDPR, but also pro-competitive in innovation too. We talked about a lot of the progress on AI and responsible ethical approaches to AI, but we need to think a bit more, I think, with regulators about talking about what people can do with these new technologies, as well as what they shouldn't do and can't do.
Oops. Thank you for that. So then I'm going to go to Chris and then to Ruth, and watch the clock, because we'll be shut down precisely at the end of it.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I think, it's funny you mentioned regulatory learnings and using that example you had. We've learned a little bit from Amazon, some of those same regulatory learnings, certainly in the United States. One aspect of policy that we've been working on is being able to deliver alcohol to customers, right? Alcohol sales online, which has been, there's a variety of antiquated laws and regulations around that just in the United States. And we discovered, obviously states discovered that their constituents, if they have to stay at home and are being told to stay at home, and they want to be able to access goods and services that they can't get in person, they want to be able to get them delivered and be able to purchase them online. And so we've seen that's a good example, I think, where states were perhaps leery of doing something that they thought was problematic, and realized actually that it works quite well, and that frankly their constituents and customers want that. And that's just, it's perhaps an esoteric example, but it's I think a broader example of this has been a forcing mechanism in many respects to see what can and can't work. And as humans, I think we have we suffer from short-term memory loss sometimes. And I'm hoping that going forward, we can keep this in mind, not just in the initial wake of COVID, but in the years to come, where some risks need to be taken a little bit. Regulatory risk can be taken, where we can innovate a little bit. We can think big picture and think big about enabling innovation and being a little bit more ambitious, I think. And so I hope that is a lesson that is learned by all going forward, because I think we need to think big. To be able to really truly embrace the digital economy and raise all constituents, all customers up in that regard.
Think big and bring that perspective into all the work with the different international organizations, right?
Absolutely.
Kind of going back to having thrown up the roadmap as an example. That's what industry can do if there's enough kind of engagement and relationships. I haven't taken too much of your time, Ruth, so how about some final observations from you?
Sure, and I will also be brief. I think circling back on some of the things that we've sort of raised and discussed before, I think it's critically important that the US and Europe sort of come up with ways to sort of work together and work in harmony on tackling some of these really critical challenges in a way that promotes and upholds our shared values across the sort of digital economy, telecommunications, policy, and regulatory landscape. I also think, as discussed, expanding these concepts of trust and security and the importance of them to a part of the broader ICT ecosystem. So not just 5G, but also think about subsea cables or cloud service providers, or all these other application layers with respect to AI and other things, that where it's still vitally important for trust and security to be present for governments, consumers, and citizens. The other thing is, I think, take very coordinated action in looking at how we can work together on helping emerging markets achieve their development and economic goals with respect to connectivity. I think, like I said, it's now is really the time for harmonized action. A lot of people have taken a look at what needs to be done, what the risks are, what the opportunity are, and now I think is the time to really take action on promoting that going forward. And then I think on the competitiveness space, particularly in the telecom sector, looking at vendor diversity and how do we work together, whether it's joint R&D or policies that promote innovation and diversification in the supply chain, whether it's the trend towards open and virtualized networks and other policies that can really create a more trusted and secure supply chain. So I think there's incredible amounts of work ahead of us, as well as incredible opportunity, and I think it's something that will be a very interesting space to watch over the coming years.
Great. Well, thank you all. This has been, to me, really fascinating and useful conversation. And hopefully many of the 200 people who registered for this had the opportunity to share it as well. So I do think next year will be extremely important in trying to make progress in all the ways that we have described. And I hope our paths will cross again as we all interact on these types of issues. So unless somebody wants to put their hand up and say something else, I think we'll probably wrap it up. And I'll just say thank you very much. And I believe